Welcome to True Wild West Love Stories, where every legend hides a heartbeat and every scar tells a truth. Thank you for watching True Wild West Love Stories, where every legend hides a heartbeat. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. And tell us in the comments. Do you believe redemption still exists in a world like this? The sun had already begun its slow descent behind the rugged mesas of Arizona territory, when the lone cowboy, Ethan Mercer, guided his weary horse down the narrow trail that snaked between cottonwoods and red rock cliffs. Dust clung to the sweat on his skin, forming a thin crust that cracked each time his muscles moved. He had been riding since dawn, pushing across parched land and quiet valleys, seeking a place to camp before nightfall. Life on the frontier had carved a hardened edge into him, yet the long journey these past weeks had sharpened that solitude even further. He carried no companions, no obligations, no fixed destination, only an unspoken purpose known solely to him. The trail eventually opened into a small clearing with a creek flowing quietly through it, its waters catching the fading golden light. Ethan tightened the reins and lowered his gaze to the water, evaluating it with the cautious instinct of a man who had spent too many years living with danger hidden behind every shadow. The land was Apache territory, and though peaceful times had grown more common in recent months, the fragile balance between settlers and the Apache people was never guaranteed. The creek might offer water and rest, but it could just as easily hide trouble. The horse drank eagerly, dipping its muzzle into the cool stream. Ethan dismounted slowly, letting his boots sink into the damp soil near the bank. He cupped water into his palms and splashed it over his face, feeling some of the day's exhaustion lift. The air here was cleaner, filled with the scent of willow and wet stone, a welcome relief from the dusty plains he had crossed. He thought perhaps he had found the perfect place to settle for the night. But then the faintest ripple of movement drifted to him, soft laughter carried by the wind, light and musical, unmistakably human. Ethan froze, lowering his posture instinctively. His hand hovered over the revolver strapped to his hip, though he did not draw it. Experience warned him not to panic, not to act rashly, not to let instinct override thought. Sound alone could deceive, especially near running water. Still he listened. The laughter came again, closer this time, followed by splashes. He knew he was not alone. Ethan stepped back from the creek, positioning himself behind a cluster of low brush. His mind calculated possibilities. Travelers? Unlikely. These lands were not frequently crossed by settlers. A patrol? But the sound was too light, too carefree, lacking the deliberate tone of warriors on duty. Then the realization settled over him. Women. Young women. Apache, most likely. The brush around him shifted in the soft breeze, offering only brief glimpses of the scene downstream. The cowboy steadied his breath and inched forward cautiously until he could see more clearly. Through parted branches, the creek widened into a shallow pool where 3 Apache women bathed without fear or hurry, their dark hair glimmering like obsidian under the sun's remnants. They moved gracefully in the water, unaware of his presence, laughing among themselves as though the world beyond the creek did not exist. Ethan knew instantly this was dangerous, far more dangerous than a band of armed warriors. Apache women did not wander alone, and where they were, warriors were never far. If he startled them, if he frightened them, if they raised an alarm, he could find himself surrounded within minutes. And in situations involving cultural boundaries, even an innocent mistake could appear threatening. He had seen enough conflicts erupt from nothing more than misunderstandings, fueled by suspicion and fear. Yet he found himself unable to turn away. Not out of desire, not out of intentions he knew better than to entertain, but simply because the moment was so profoundly unexpected. After years of harsh living, loneliness, and the constant strain of survival, the sight of carefree life, of joy untouched by hardship, felt like something he had not witnessed in ages. It reminded him of a gentler world he no longer believed still existed. He realized he needed to leave before he was discovered. But before he could retreat, one of the women suddenly turned her head. Her eyes swept across the landscape with the alertness of someone raised in a world where awareness meant survival. Her gaze paused, Ethan did not know if she saw him, but instinct told him he could not remain hidden much longer. He stepped out slowly, deliberately, showing his hands, ensuring no sudden movements could be misinterpreted. His heart thudded dully in his chest as the women noticed him. Their laughter ceased. Water stilled around them as the air shifted into tension. Ethan remained perfectly still, letting the moment settle. He did not reach for his weapon. He did not turn to run. Any movement could trigger panic. One of the women backed away slightly, her expression caution mixed with confusion. Another narrowed her gaze, assessing him with the fierce, unwavering steadiness Apache people were known for. The third looked more curious than afraid, though she remained guarded. They spoke to one another in hushed tones, their voices tinted with concern. Though Ethan could not understand the words, he recognized their meaning. Who was this stranger? Why was he here? And what did he intend? His own intentions were simple: avoid creating danger where none was meant. He took one slow step backward, making it clear he meant no harm and wished only to leave. But the women watched him closely, uncertainty flickering across their faces. They were vulnerable in the water, and they knew it. If he turned his back now, they might think he intended something else. If he stayed, they might consider him a threat. It was a fragile moment, resting on the edge of misunderstanding. Then, from the ridge above the creek, a sound broke the tension, a faint whistle, sharp and precise, signaling someone nearby. The women straightened instantly. Hope flashed in their eyes, though tinged with apprehension. The whistle came again, closer this time. It was a call, a warning, or perhaps an inquiry from someone who expected them to respond. Ethan's pulse quickened. Apache warriors. He needed to think fast. If the warriors saw him near the bathing women, no explanation would matter. They would assume the worst, and the land would swallow him before he could escape. But something unexpected happened. One of the women, the one who had watched him the longest, suddenly stepped toward him. Her expression was stern but not hostile. She lifted a hand slightly, palm forward, as if urging him to stay where he was instead of fleeing. Ethan did not understand. He remained frozen, watching as she gestured again, turning her head toward the ridge, then back toward him. Her intentions were unclear, but her urgency was unmistakable. It was as though she feared the misunderstanding as much as he did. Another whistle echoed, closer now. The women exchanged anxious glances. The one nearest him pointed to a narrow alcove of boulders near the creek, an area hidden from the ridge above. Then she met his gaze, making her intent clear. She wanted him concealed before whoever was approaching arrived. Ethan's instincts cried out against the idea of letting strangers dictate his movements, especially in dangerous territory. But the alternative, being spotted standing near 3 bathing Apache women, would be far worse. He nodded once and moved quietly toward the shadows behind the boulders. The women hurriedly slipped deeper into the water for safety, and within moments the ridge above rustled as 2 Apache warriors appeared, scanning the area. Ethan held his breath. From his concealed position, he could see the women answering the warriors' calls with confident tones, their composure surprising given the closeness of danger. The warriors did not look suspicious. The women spoke easily, as though nothing was amiss. The men remained only briefly before nodding and moving on down the trail in the opposite direction. When the danger passed, the women allowed themselves a breath of relief. Ethan waited until they gestured for him to step out. The air between them had changed. A strange, fragile understanding pulsed beneath the surface, one forged in shared danger rather than spoken words. Though still cautious, the women no longer looked at him with fear. If anything, they studied him with a mixture of curiosity, caution, and something he could not quite identify. He knew he had to leave this place before nightfall tightened its grip, but what had happened here felt like the beginning of something far deeper than chance. As Ethan backed away from the creek, stepping onto the trail once more, he felt the weight of their gazes following him. Not as enemies, but as witnesses to a moment neither culture was accustomed to sharing. The land around him seemed quieter when he finally turned away, yet an unexpected shift had already begun, one that neither he nor the Apache women could have foreseen. a crossing of paths, a disruption of solitude, a spark in the wilderness that would not fade easily. And as the evening shadows stretched long across the land, the story was only just beginning. The night settled over the Arizona territory with a quiet heaviness, spreading shadows across the land like a slow-moving tide. Ethan Mercer rode several miles from the creek before stopping beneath the shelter of a granite overhang, where the land dipped enough to hide the glow of a small fire. His horse grazed nearby, unbothered by the deepening cold. Ethan sat with his back against the stone, his eyes fixed on the meager flame that flickered like a heartbeat in the darkness. Most nights he found comfort in silence, but tonight it felt sharper than usual. The memory of the creek played again and again in his mind, the sudden discovery, the stilled laughter, the wary glances of the 3 Apache women, and the near arrival of the warriors. It was a moment he should have forgotten as quickly as it happened, yet something about it clung to him with unusual weight. He knew he had come close to danger, closer than most frontiersmen ever survived. Trespassing near a secluded bathing place was enough to spark bloodshed between men who did not understand one another's worlds. Yet instead of calling for help, instead of turning him over to the approaching warriors, the women had warned him, they had shielded him, they had spared him. He had seen cooperation between settlers and the Apache before, but rarely in matters touching upon vulnerability or trust. The events at the creek had cracked open a space he could not easily categorize. And though the land around him was still, Ethan felt an undercurrent of unease, as if the consequences of what happened had not yet begun to unfold. As the fire crackled softly, fatigue settled into his bones. The long ride, the tension, and the strange sense of unfinished business all pressed down on him. Rest should have come easily, but instead he lay awake most of the night, turning the memory over and over like a stone in his hand. When dawn finally broke, he rose with a sense of unresolved purpose. The horizon glowed with pale amber light, and the first warmth of the day brushed across his skin. He saddled his horse and set off toward the north, intending to put distance between himself and the creek. But the land had a way of steering its own course. Trails curved, instincts tugged, and his thoughts drifted back to the 3 women whose faces he could not forget. He tried to dismiss it. He told himself he owed them nothing and needed nothing from them. Yet something inside him resisted the idea of leaving, without understanding why they had chosen not to expose him. Gratitude, curiosity, and a faint unshaped sense of responsibility stirred within him. Though he would not yet name it, hours passed beneath a broad sky streaked with clouds. Ethan followed a ridge that overlooked sweeping valleys of tall grass and red earth. Far to the east, a faint column of smoke rose. Apache campfires often left thin trails like that, though he could not be sure. The territory held countless places where people lived beyond maps and borders. As he descended from the ridge, the land grew quiet in a way that signaled someone had passed recently. Tracks dotted the soil, hoof prints, footprints, broken reeds, shifted rocks. Ethan dismounted to study them and realized quickly that a group had moved through the area only hours earlier. The spacing of the prints, the depth of the impressions, and the direction of travel all revealed a story to a man who had spent years reading the land. The tracks belonged to Apache people. Several adults, 2 horses, possibly more unseen. His instincts urged him to turn away, to avoid anything that might connect him again with the previous night's encounter. But something drew him forward, not recklessness, not carelessness, something quieter, as if fate had nudged him into a path already unfolding. He followed the tracks at a distance, careful to leave no trace of his own presence. The trail led him through a valley of cottonwoods and further east toward a broken line of cliffs. The closer he came, the more signs he noticed. Discarded fibers from woven baskets, the faint outline of a rest stop, and even remnants of footprints similar to those he saw near the creek. He paused when he recognized the size and pattern of 3 distinct prints, the women's footprints. They had traveled with the group. This discovery should have brought relief. They were safe, moving with their people away from danger, but instead it brought a tightening unease. If the warriors had learned of a stranger's presence at the creek, their mood might not be calm. If they suspected anything improper, the women might face harsh questions or worse. Apache communities protected their own fiercely. Even innocent encounters could be twisted into something darker depending on who told the story. A tension clung to the air as Ethan moved forward. He kept low, using shrubs and rock formations as cover. The sound of distant horses grew clearer. Then the faint echo of hurried movement drifted from the cliffs ahead, soft but urgent. Something was wrong. Ethan left his horse tethered behind a juniper tree and continued on foot, steps measured and silent. He climbed a narrow path that curved along the base of a rock wall and then stopped abruptly when he heard rustling voices carried by the wind. Men. Multiple men. Rougher than the Apache voices he had heard before. Their tone lacked the grounded cadence of people native to this land. Ethan remained motionless, listening closely. It took only a moment for him to understand. They were not Apache. They were settlers, drifters, white men moving through restricted territory without permission, and by the sound of their heavy steps, they were searching for something. Then he heard a second sound, softer, fearful, a pattern of movement signaling someone hiding, being pursued. Ethan pressed forward until he reached a vantage point overlooking a small depression in the land. What he saw tightened his breath. The 3 Apache women from the creek were down below, crouched behind a cluster of boulders. Their garments were hurriedly thrown around them, hair still damp from where they had bathed earlier. Their expressions were tense, wary, and confused. They looked cornered. 3 white men advanced toward them from opposite sides, their movements aggressive, their intentions unmistakably hostile. Ethan recognized the type, opportunistic wanderers who roamed the frontier feeding off chaos. Men who ignored territory lines, who believed they operated beyond consequence. Men who saw unprotected women not as human beings but as prey. The situation was worse than danger. It was a disaster waiting to explode. If Apache warriors found these men threatening their women, a blood feud could erupt across the region. Settlers and Apache communities would clash again, reviving old scars. And somehow, Ethan had been drawn to this very crossroads. Without speaking, without thinking of risk, he began to descend the ridge. His movements were controlled, silent, shaped by years of living in peril. He understood the severity of the moment. The women could not run. They were trapped between rock formations and the advancing men. He needed to intervene before violence ignited something much larger. He slipped through narrow gaps between boulders and moved across the uneven ground, closing distance without being detected. From the shadows, he saw one of the women tense as a man approached her hiding place. Her hand reached instinctively toward a stone she could use as a weapon, though she knew it would hardly be enough. The other women crouched beside her, poised to defend one another, though the odds were dire. Ethan knew he had only one chance. Using the terrain to his advantage, he disrupted the nearest man, striking him from behind with calculated force. The impact sent the man staggering into the gravel, groaning as he hit the ground. The other 2 turned, startled and furious, scanning for the source of the attack. The women's eyes widened with recognition when they saw him. They did not trust him, but they remembered him. And most importantly, they understood that he had acted not out of threat but protection. Chaos erupted in the clearing as the remaining men lunged toward Ethan. He used footwork shaped by necessity, dodging blows and maneuvering the terrain to weaken his opponent's advantage. The Apache women scrambled away from the immediate conflict, taking shelter behind larger stones where they could observe without drawing further danger toward themselves. After a brutal struggle, the attackers realized they were outmatched and retreated, fleeing into the brush, cursing and stumbling over the uneven ground. Ethan remained on guard until he was certain they were gone, scanning the hills for movement. The land grew quiet once more. Only then did he allow his breath to steady. The women emerged cautiously from behind the rocks, still fearful but no longer cornered. They studied him with complex expressions. Unease, gratitude, and reluctant understanding blended into one. Though they did not speak, their eyes carried enough meaning to bridge the silence. They had been spared harm. He had intervened. A connection shaped not by choice but by consequence now bound them together. The tension in the air did not fade, for the danger had only shifted. Those men would return, or someone worse might follow, and once word spread that Apache women had been found alone in the wilderness, more trouble could rise. Ethan sensed the weight of the unfolding situation. The women's tribe might misunderstand what had happened. He might be accused of involvement. The drifters might return seeking revenge. Any direction the path took held risk. But despite all this, the presence of the women stirred something steady inside him, a sense of responsibility he had not expected to feel. The sun slid lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the valley, signaling the approach of another night. The women stood across from him, still watchful, but no longer fearful. And as the quiet settled once more over the land, Ethan knew that the events of the day had already set the course for something far greater than he had intended. What began at the creek was no longer an isolated moment. It had become the beginning of a new and dangerous trail. The valley lay steeped in uneasy quiet after the confrontation. Its stillness stretched thin like a hide pulled taut across a frame. Ethan stood on the uneven ground, his breath gradually steadying as he surveyed the terrain for any sign of returning danger. The Apache women remained a short distance away, poised like wary deer assessing whether the threat had truly passed. Their forms were partially hidden behind the rocks, although they no longer crouched with fear. Instead, they observed him with a mixture of curiosity and guarded caution. A faint breeze drifted through the brush, carrying with it the faint scent of sage and warm dust. The long shadows cast by the sun's descent painted the cliffs in rusty strokes, giving the land a rugged, solemn beauty. Despite the serenity that slowly reclaimed the valley, Ethan felt the ripple of tension beneath it. Silent, yet unmistakable, a reminder that what had occurred here would echo long beyond the moment. He took several steps away from the women, ensuring he did not crowd them or inadvertently appear threatening, though they had witnessed his efforts to help. Trust was fragile in such lands. Every movement he made was measured, respectful of the invisible lines drawn by culture and circumstance. The women seemed to notice this, and their posture relaxed slightly, though uncertainty still rested in their eyes. They stood together now, as though silently communicating among themselves. Their expressions shifted subtly, one appearing thoughtful, another apprehensive, and the third seemingly torn between suspicion and reluctant acknowledgement of his intervention. The memory of him at the creek had already bound them in an unexpected way, and the events that followed tightened that connection even more. The land often decided alliances before words ever could. As the silence stretched on, Ethan sensed a practical concern rising above everything else. The men who had attacked would not give up so easily. Desperation made people reckless. Greed made them persistent. The women had become targets, not just witnesses, and the danger would not fade with the setting sun. The drifters would regroup, and this time they might return with greater numbers or more cunning intentions. He took a slow survey of the valley again, noting the angles of shadow, the dips in the terrain that offered concealment, and the narrow choke points where someone could be ambushed. His mind moved through the land with the practiced skill of a man who had survived too many confrontations to underestimate any possibility. He knew the women were vulnerable out here, especially if their tribe was unaware of the threat approaching. The women seemed to sense his thoughts. Without speaking, they gestured toward the cliffs rising behind them, subtle movements of their hands indicating a trail or passage hidden from obvious view. Ethan recognized the invitation for what it was, an unspoken acceptance that he was now part of this unfolding danger. Whether by fate or circumstance, they understood that he had chosen to intervene on their behalf, and that turning away now might mean abandoning them to harm. Still, he hesitated. His presence near Apache women, especially unaccompanied, could lead to grave misunderstandings. If their people found him in the wrong place at the wrong time, they might assume he was a threat, no matter how the women tried to explain. But as he studied their expressions, he saw no fear of him, only of what hunted them. The weight of that realization settled heavily in his chest. The women moved toward the narrow passage between the cliffs, walking with a measured pace. They made no sign for him to follow, yet their glances back toward him carried clear meaning. They trusted his instinct enough to let him remain close. The land around them darkened as the sun dipped lower, coating the rock faces in shadows that stretched like dark wings across the ground. Ethan followed at a respectful distance, weaving between boulders and low shrubs until he reached the mouth of the hidden trail. It twisted upward through a narrow gap in the cliff face, barely wide enough for a man to pass without brushing the walls. The women ascended it lightly, moving with the confidence of people who knew every ridge and turn of the terrain. Ethan moved more cautiously, mindful of loose stones that might slide under his boots and alert any pursuers. As they climbed, the sounds of the valley shifted. Crickets, beginning their twilight song, the distant call of a hawk circling overhead, the soft scrape of stone against skin. The trail eventually opened into a hanging ledge, overlooking a wide stretch of land. From this vantage point, the world below appeared vast and exposed, its vulnerabilities clear to any seasoned eyes. This spot offered safety, height, and concealment. It was a place chosen with purpose. A cluster of trees stood a few paces back from the ledge, sheltering a small hollow beneath them. Signs of temporary use were faint but recognizable. A flattened patch of grass, a few dry embers from an old fire, a scatter of fresh footprints. It seemed the women had passed through here earlier, perhaps resting or scouting before entering the creek. Their familiarity with the place explained their instinct to return now. Ethan settled near the entrance of the hollow, careful to leave space between himself and the women. He noticed them watching him as the sky deepened to indigo. The last strands of sunset burned low on the horizon, painting the clouds a muted rose. For a long time, none of them moved. They simply shared the same quiet space, drawn together by circumstance yet bound by caution. As darkness gathered, the temperature began to drop. The desert's warmth bled away quickly after twilight, leaving the air sharp and cool. Ethan wrapped his arms around himself, adjusting his position to conserve heat. The women stood closer together near the shelter of the trees, their silhouettes merging with the shadows. Though they still kept distance between him and themselves, they no longer looked at him as an intruder, but as a presence reluctantly accepted into their temporary refuge. The deeper the night grew, the more Ethan's mind wandered to the consequences awaiting them all. If the attackers returned, they might follow the women's tracks toward the ridge. If Apache warriors found the attackers' traces intermixed with Ethan's, misunderstandings could spread like wildfire. And if the tribe believed he had any involvement in harming their women, no explanation would erase the suspicion. The frontier had taught him many lessons, and one of its harshest truths was that intent mattered far less than perception. Yet, despite all these thoughts, something in him refused to walk away, not after what had unfolded. Responsibility anchored him to the moment, stronger than fear or doubt. Perhaps it was because the women had spared him at the creek when they could have condemned him. Perhaps it was because he had seen the raw fear in their expressions when the drifters approached. Whatever the reason, he could not bring himself to abandon them to uncertainty. As the first stars pierced the darkening sky, the women settled near the hollow, their posture easing slightly. Ethan remained at a distance, keeping watch over the trail they had climbed. His eyes scanned the horizon, alert for any unusual movement. He had endured many sleepless nights before, but none that felt quite like this, suspended in fragile equilibrium between danger and a strange, unspoken alliance. Hours passed. The moon lifted above the cliffs, casting a pale glow over the landscape. Its light revealed more details, the ripple of brush caught in the wind, the shifting patterns of sand along the trail, the way the women seemed to sleep in turns, each one guarding the others even as fatigue weighed upon them. Ethan remained awake longer than he intended, listening to the rhythm of the night. Every sound held meaning, the scuttle of a small desert creature, the whisper of leaves, the distant thud of hooves somewhere far across the valley floor. He tensed at the last sound, uncertain if it was real or imagined, but it faded quickly and did not return. Just as he began to relax, a flicker of movement caught the corner of his eye. A shadow shifted near the base of the trail far below, small but deliberate. He strained to focus, letting his breath still to sharpen his senses. Another movement followed, slow, creeping, too controlled to be an animal. Someone was tracking them. The realization dropped like a stone into his stomach. It could be the drifters seeking revenge, or perhaps scouts from the Apache tribe. Either possibility carried grave danger. He rose quietly, signaling the women with his posture rather than words. They sensed the change immediately, rising from their positions with silent precision. Their alertness returned in an instant. The shape below moved again, now closer, edging up the trail they had taken. The women exchanged looks filled with calculation, weighing the threat without panic. Ethan's pulse quickened. If the attackers reached the ledge, they would catch them with limited escape routes. The terrain favored defenders, but only if they acted before being cornered. The night pressed tighter as the danger approached, and the rhythm of the land shifted from quiet to charged. The women moved closer to Ethan, each step deliberate, unified by necessity. Their earlier uncertainty toward him dimmed, overshadowed by the greater danger closing in, and in that single moment, as the first faint outline of a pursuer appeared at the lower bend of the trail, Ethan understood that the fragile bond they had formed was no longer just a coincidence of circumstances. It was the beginning of a shared fight for survival. The night would not pass quietly, and whatever approached would test the limits of trust and instinct. The following days unfolded with a strange mixture of quiet harmony and uneasy tension, the kind that often hangs in the air before a great shift in fate. After the creek encounter and the fragile trust that had begun to form, the cowboy, Elias Ward, found himself adjusting to life with the 3 Apache women who had entered his world as unexpectedly as a sudden desert storm. Naira, the eldest and steady-minded, Sani, the fierce protector, and Tala, the youngest, whose gentle curiosity kept her hovering near him like a cautious fawn. Elias had spent years alone, years so quiet that even the echo of his own bootsteps had once felt like company. But now there were new rhythms around him, soft footsteps near the morning fire, the rustle of woven baskets being set down on the cabin porch, the low hum of Apache songs drifting through the cottonwoods at dusk. These small sounds reshaped the silence he had long believed he preferred, and yet, beneath the growing familiarity lay a lingering question. Why had they been alone at the creek that day? Who had they been fleeing, if anyone? And what danger might be following them? Naira did not speak much of their past, but her glances toward the horizon told more than words ever could. Sani's habit of scanning the tree line before settling near the fire, spear always within reach, confirmed that whatever shadow lay behind them had not disappeared. And Tala, though she carried the least weight of understanding, clung close to her sisters in ways that suggested fear more than innocence. Elias, though hesitant to pry, understood that a man living alone in these lands could not afford to ignore danger, especially when it walked so closely to his own doorstep. The land around Elias's cabin had always been generous to him. The creek offered water, the forest provided game, and the open plains yielded grazing space for the few horses he kept. Now, with 3 additional souls relying on the same resources, Elias found himself hunting more often, riding out farther and returning later each night. During those long rides he felt the shift most deeply. He was no longer hunting only for himself. The cabin no longer felt like a place for a solitary man to waste away comfortably. It felt like something alive, something needing to be protected. And that sense of protection grew stronger after the first sign of trouble. It began with tracks. 3 sets of hoof prints cutting across the softened dirt not far from the cabin's clearing. Elias spotted them early one morning while gathering firewood. The impressions were deep, fresh, and left by horses not familiar to him. He crouched, touching the edge of the nearest print, noting the direction and the spacing. Whoever passed through had been riding hard and fast. Elias had lived long enough on the frontier to know the difference between a rancher's leisurely ride and the determined pursuit of men on a mission. These were the tracks of hunters. When he returned to the cabin, the women sensed the change in him instantly. Though Elias kept his thoughts quiet, Naira's eyes lingered on him, knowing without asking. Her gaze held something heavy, something confirming what he feared. Whatever they were running from was closer now. That evening, the sky turned a deep bruised purple as the sun fell behind the mountains. The wind carried a cold bite, stirring the pines and making the air feel restless. The Apache women built the fire inside the cabin rather than outside for warmth and safety, and Elias remained near the doorway, listening to the forest as though he expected it to speak. The night stretched on, and though the women eventually drifted into sleep, Elias remained awake. His instincts gnawed at him like an old wound reopening. Lone riders did not cross this land unintentionally, especially not at this time of year. Somewhere deep in the forest, a branch snapped, a clean, swift break that did not belong to the shifting of animals. Elias rose slowly, his hand reaching for the rifle beside the chair. He stepped outside, boots sinking softly into the cool dirt, and let the quiet swallow him. No lantern, no fire, only moonlight and silence. The forest watched him, still and knowing. Then another sound, a faint murmur, too far to decipher but close enough to confirm he was not alone. Elias's grip tightened. After long minutes, the sounds faded, swallowed by distance or shadow, leaving him standing under the moon with more certainty than ever that danger was threading itself around them. Morning came with a strange calm. The women emerged from the cabin wrapped in handmade blankets, their expressions weary from uneasy sleep. Elias brewed coffee, handing Naira a cup though she rarely drank it. She accepted, a sign she wished to speak. Naira had always carried a quiet strength, but today her shoulders seemed weighted by something heavier than the night's fear. Her gaze drifted toward the forest, then back to Elias, as if she had finally decided the moment could not be delayed any longer. Though she spoke no words aloud, the story unfolded through her gestures, her eyes, and the unspoken language the frontier often demanded from those who had no luxury of wasted breath. Her clan had been attacked, not by rival tribes, nor soldiers, but by a band of renegade men from the territory south, men who had hunted them before, treating Apache lands as though they were lawless plains to claim and ravage. The women had survived by fleeing while the rest of their people scattered in different directions. For days they walked, avoiding every known trail, finding safety where they could. The creek, the bathing, the brief moment of peace. They had believed themselves alone, until the cowboy stepped into their path. Elias absorbed every unspoken detail with a tightening in his chest. These women were not merely wandering or seeking refuge, they were being pursued. And now, by offering them shelter, he had stepped directly between them and the men who wanted them dead or captured. Still, Elias did not waver. Danger had been his companion for years, loneliness had been far worse. But danger for himself was one thing. Danger that threatened those under his roof awakened something deeper, a responsibility he had not felt in years. Later that afternoon, while Elias inspected the horses near the corral, Sani appeared silently behind him. She approached with slow, deliberate steps, spear in hand, her expression carved with concern. She pointed toward the ridge behind the cabin, where the land dipped into thick woods. Elias followed her gesture and noticed something he had missed earlier, a thin curl of smoke rising above the treetops, too small to be a camp of wanderers, too controlled to be accidental. Someone was out there, watching. Sani's hand tightened around the spear. The message was clear. Those who hunted them were closing in. The hours that followed carried an urgency Elias had not felt since his younger days as a ranch hand, defending his employer's land from rustlers. He prepared the cabin quietly but thoroughly, reinforcing the door, checking the ammunition, placing tools where they could serve as weapons if needed. The Apache women contributed in their own way. Sani sharpened her spear and fashioned 2 additional wooden points, each carved with precision. Naira gathered herbs and crafted small pouches filled with bitter powders, meant to disorient anyone who inhaled them. Even Tala, young and afraid, collected firewood and tied it neatly in bundles for quick access. There was no spoken plan. There didn't need to be one. The land around them had become a shared shield, and each one of them understood their role in its defense. At sunset, Elias rode out alone to scout the ridge. The air felt heavy, suffocating. Every rustle of leaves seemed deliberate, every snap of twig purposeful. As he reached the high ground, he spotted movement in the distance, 3 figures moving between trees with unsettling confidence. Their coats were dark, their rifles slung lazily across their backs, as though they believed no one in these lands could oppose them. Elias recognized the type immediately: hired guns, drifters who sold their violence to the highest bidder. Men like these rarely feared consequences. They believed the world belonged to the ruthless. They were studying the valley below, studying the cabin. Elias did not linger. He rode back fast, the horse pounding the earth beneath him. When he returned to the clearing, the women were waiting, their faces grave but steady. Night hung over them like a tightening snare. They could flee now, under cover of darkness, slipping into the mountains where pursuit would be difficult, or they could stay and stand their ground. Elias knew the women were capable of disappearing into the wilderness. Apache women were born of resilience. But leaving now meant abandoning the fragile refuge they had built together. It meant running again, perhaps endlessly. Elias also knew that if he stayed behind to fight alone, the men might follow the women regardless. And 3 determined predators could track almost anyone through unfamiliar land. Naira looked at him with eyes filled not with fear but with a question. The choice was his as much as theirs. Elias felt the weight of everything he had lived through, loneliness, loss, survival, and realized that fate had finally placed something in his path worth protecting, worth risking the quiet life he had built. Whether by instinct or something deeper, he made his decision before the thought fully formed. He would stand with them. Whatever storm was coming, they would face it together. The cabin grew silent as the women prepared for rest, though none of them truly slept. Elias sat near the window, rifle across his lap, watching the dark ridge for any sign of movement. The fire crackled softly, casting shadows that danced across the wooden walls. Outside, the land held its breath. Not even the owls dared to call. Far in the distance, a coyote howled, a long, wavering cry that seemed to warn of the danger creeping closer. Elias knew the coming night would bring confrontation. The tracks, the smoke, the figures on the ridge, every sign pointed to a single truth. The hunters were ready, and they would come soon. As the fire dimmed to embers, Elias inhaled deeply, letting the scent of pine and smoke steady him. The women rested behind him, trusting that he would keep watch. And so he did. Until the first hint of danger stirred again in the woods. Closer this time, deliberate and unhidden. Elias rose slowly, shoulders tightening. The storm had arrived. The night unfolded with a dreadful slowness, as though time itself wished to delay the inevitable clash that hung over the land like a suffocating cloud. Elias remained at the window, his breath steady but controlled, his rifle laid across his knees. The soft glow of embers flickered against the log walls, casting shifting shadows that moved like watchful spirits. Behind him, the 3 Apache women rested lightly, though none truly slept. Their bodies were still, but their senses were sharp beneath the veil of half-rest, ready to awaken at the smallest hint of danger. Outside, the winds whispered among the pines, carrying with them the distant scent of smoke, not the comforting smoke of a campfire, but the sharper, more deliberate smell of torches carried through a forest by men who intended harm. The hunters were near now. There was no more waiting for tracks, no more searching for signs on the ridge or scanning faint smoke trails. Their presence seeped through the midnight air with the certainty of a predator crouched just beyond sight. Elias felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the old instinct that stirred whenever danger pushed him toward a line he could not retreat from. Years of solitude had dulled some parts of him, but not this. The frontier had carved vigilance into his bones, and now every part of him awakened, sharpening like a blade being honed. The forest's usual rhythm, its rustles, chirps, and distant calls, fell away, replaced by a suffocating hush. Even the horses in the corral shifted anxiously, their hooves tapping restlessly against the dirt. Animals always sensed the approach of violence long before humans. The moment finally came when the shadows at the tree line thickened into recognizable shapes. 3 figures emerged from the darkness, moving with a confidence born of cruelty and experience. The flickering light of their torches illuminated hardened expressions and coats dusted from travel. Their steps were slow, deliberate, as though savoring the hunt. Elias's jaw tightened. These were the same men he had seen on the ridge, the same hunters who chased the Apache women across miles of unforgiving land. Their presence in the clearing was not a question of chance. It was a convergence of inevitable paths. Inside the cabin, Naira stirred first, lifting herself silently from the bed. Her eyes met Elias's, and though no words passed between them, the exchange carried everything: resolve, fear, trust. Sani rose next, gripping her spear with purpose, her posture steady and unflinching. Even Tala, the youngest, sensed the shift, moving closer to her sisters, seeking their strength. The cabin, once a refuge of quiet, became a fortress in that breathless moment. Outside, the hunters paused near the tree line. Their torches illuminated the dirt in a ring of orange glow, distorting their shadows into tall, monstrous shapes that danced against the ground. They surveyed the clearing with predatory precision, their gaze slowly drifting toward the cabin. Elias knew the moment had come. The waiting ended, and the night prepared to split open. The men did not approach immediately. Instead, they circled just within the torchlight, inspecting the surroundings, gauging their approach. They knew someone was inside. They knew the cabin was occupied. And hunters like these preferred to corner their prey before striking. Elias breathed deeply, grounding himself. The rifle felt heavy yet familiar in his grip, its weight grounding him in a moment that promised either survival or ruin. The Apache women positioned themselves with practiced quiet, a spear ready at one window, a set of Naira's herb pouches placed beside the door, Tala hiding behind the table to stay out of harm's way yet close enough to assist if needed. The forest shuddered as the first man stepped forward, torch lifted higher. His posture lacked any hint of fear. He moved like someone who believed themselves unstoppable. But belief was not the same as truth. The second man followed, his hand resting on his holstered weapon, relaxed yet ready. The third man, taller than the others, scanned the cabin with eyes that missed nothing. He had the air of a leader, calculating, methodical, cold. They closed in slowly. Elias adjusted his aim through the cracks between the wooden boards. His breathing settled into a rhythm, steady as the slow sweep of wind through the grass. Then the men made their move. Torches were thrown first, an attempt to burn him out, smoke him out, force him and the women into the open. Flames licked at the outer walls of the cabin, but Elias had built it well, the logs dampened by recent rain and resistant to immediate ignition. Elias fired the first shot. The force echoed through the valley like thunder ripping across the night sky. One of the torches fell, extinguishing in the dirt. The hunters scattered behind fallen logs and thick brush, turning the clearing into a battlefield of shadows and desperate cover. The confrontation had begun. The forest erupted with motion. Gunfire cracked through the night, each shot carving through branches, thudding into the strong walls of the cabin. The Apache women moved in unison, each action a testament to resilience sculpted by generations of survival. Sani launched her spear through one of the window gaps. It soared like a swift shadow, striking one of the attackers and forcing him deeper into cover. He shouted in pain, stumbling back as the spear embedded itself in the dirt beside him. Naira lit two of her herbal pouches using the embers from the fire pit and tossed them through another gap. The pouches hit the ground near the hunters, bursting into clouds of acrid smoke. It wasn't lethal, but it burned the eyes and lungs, weakening their focus, forcing them to retreat a few steps. Tala gathered water and blankets, preparing to smother any flames that might attempt to crawl into the cabin. Her hands shook at first, but she steadied herself quickly, driven by the weight of the moment. The hunters, though startled, were not dissuaded. Their shouts grew sharper, angrier. They fired again, bullets slicing through the cabin's wooden frame. Splinters flew through the air like tiny shards of shrapnel. Elias waited for a lull between their shots before returning fire, hitting one man's shoulder and forcing him into the dirt. The leader growled orders, his voice cold even amid the chaos. He directed the two remaining attackers with a certainty that told Elias these men had fought more than once under the cloak of lawlessness. The clearing burned with intensity. Sparks flew as torchlight mixed with gunfire. Smoke curled through the branches, weaving between the trees like restless spirits summoned by violence. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. The hunters were no longer advancing but regrouping behind heavy brush and fallen logs. Elias sensed their hesitation. The presence of three women fighting with such coordination had shaken their expectations. These men had come expecting easy prey. Instead, they encountered a united resistance. The leader motioned for his companions to flank the cabin. One moved toward the corral, another toward the storage shed. Elias recognized the tactic. They sought angles he could not easily defend. He adjusted his position, firing a warning shot that drove one man behind a tree. But the other pressed on, creeping closer in a crouched stance. Before Elias could reposition, Sani acted. She grabbed the remaining spear and slipped out the back door, her feet barely touching the ground as she moved like a shadow dancing across moonlit leaves. She circled behind the shed, cutting off the man's advance. The confrontation was swift and fierce. Though Sani carried only a spear against a gun, her agility and precision gave her the advantage in close combat. Elias heard the struggle, the thud of bodies, the scuffle of boots, but he could not look away from the window where the leader prepared his next strike. Naira stayed near him, tossing another herbal pouch to block the leader's line of sight. The smoke forced the man back several paces, but only for a moment. He re-emerged, angrier than before. Elias knew the final push was coming. The leader raised his hand, signaling the last remaining hunter to regroup. Their movements shifted, more aggressive now, more reckless. The fight dragged on long enough for desperation to settle into their bones. Then they charged. The two men burst from the brush with a burst of speed meant to overwhelm. Elias fired, grazing one but failing to stop him. They closed in, one aiming for the door, the other for the window. Inside the cabin, Tala screamed silently, grabbing the bucket of water as flames from the earlier torches finally began licking the doorway. She poured the water swiftly, dousing the small fire before it could grow. Naira handed Elias the final pouch, one she had saved for this moment, filled with bitter powder strong enough to blind temporarily. Elias struck it against the window frame, sending a cloud of dust exploding into the attacker's face as he tried to climb inside. The man stumbled back, coughing violently, his vision stolen by the burning powder. The leader forced the door open, slamming his shoulder against the weakened wood. Elias rushed forward, meeting him with the full weight of his strength. Their bodies collided, the impact echoing through the cabin. The fight was brutal. Years of loneliness had hardened Elias, but the leader was larger, used to violence as a language. They wrestled across the cabin floor, knocking over chairs and scattering embers. Naira and Tala stayed back, understanding that interfering could risk Elias's focus. The struggle intensified until Elias gained the upper hand, drawing on a surge of protective fury he had not felt in years. With one powerful motion, he disarmed the man, the gun clattering to the floor. The leader, defeated but alive, stared up at Elias with a mixture of shock and rage. In the seconds that followed, Sani reappeared at the open doorway, her spear bloodied but her stance victorious. She had survived her battle, and now stood united with Elias. The hunters, beaten and broken, lay scattered across the clearing. The danger had not disappeared entirely, but the night belonged to Elias and the Apache women. Silence washed over the land once more, but it was a different silence, one heavy with exhaustion, relief, and the faint trembling echo of survival. The forest released its breath. The winds softened. The horses calmed. Inside the cabin, the four souls who had stood together against hunters and flames gathered in the dim light of dying embers. Elias's chest rose and fell with the weight of everything he had fought for, everything he had protected. The Apache women, though bruised and weary, radiated an unspoken gratitude and trust deeper than words could express. The night had changed them forever, and though the danger had passed, the next day would bring questions that lingered like the smoke drifting above the treetops. Because surviving the night was one thing, deciding what future awaited them together was another. Dawn crept slowly over the mountains, its pale gold light spilling across the battered clearing like a gentle truth arriving after a long night of lies. The cabin, though scarred from gunfire and scorched at its edges, still stood firm. A stubborn reminder of resilience etched into timber and stone. The clearing around it held evidence of the struggle that had taken place: trampled earth, scattered weapons, streaks of blood, and the quiet stillness of defeated hunters lying where fate had brought them down. Elias stepped out to face the morning, his breath visible in the cool air. A heaviness clung to him, part exhaustion, part the lingering pulse of battle. The forest was quiet again, but not in the fearful way it had been before the attack. This was the steady quiet after a storm, the kind that wrapped the land in a blanket of fragile peace. Behind him, the Apache women emerged one by one, their movements slow but purposeful. Sani carried herself with the strength of someone who had stood face to face with death and refused to bow to it. Naira's robes were smudged with dust and herbs, evidence of the remedies she had used through the night on both wounds and spirits. Tala stayed close to them, her eyes reflecting the strange mixture of fear, relief, and wonder that often followed survival. The four of them stood together in the clearing, bathed in the morning glow, united not by choice at first, but by the demands of the wilderness and the weight of shared danger. The remnants of the night's violence did not separate them. Instead, they drew them closer, weaving an unspoken thread through their hearts. Elias walked toward the tree line to examine the trail, determining whether the hunters had been acting alone or if others might follow. Tracks showed the path of their arrival clearly, 3 sets of footprints made by men who believed themselves invincible. Now they were simply silent marks in the dusty earth, fading already under the warmth of the rising sun. The Apache women remained near the cabin door, watching him, trusting him in a way none of them had dared before. The bond that had formed was not careless or sudden. It was a bond made through fire and persistence, born from the shared understanding that survival meant something different now. The forest around them awakened gradually. Birds tentatively resumed their songs. Leaves rustled in the morning wind. The horses wandered back toward the corral, their nerves finally eased. Even the creek resumed its peaceful murmur, unaware of the turmoil from the night before. Elias returned to the women, with a silent reassurance reflected in his steady movements. The hunters had come alone. No sign suggested a larger force trailing behind them. The danger, for now, had been extinguished, but safety did not bring instant clarity. Questions waited like stones along their path. Questions about where they should go, what would become of the 4 of them, and whether the bond they had formed could endure beyond the urgency of battle. Inside the cabin, the warmth of the hearth pushed back the morning chill. Naira prepared simple herbs to treat their bruises. Sani wrapped a cloth around her arm, where a scratch from her struggle with the hunter had left an angry red welt. Tala sat near the fire, running her fingers gently through the fur of Elias' old saddle blanket, a small gesture of comfort after a long night. Elias took time repairing the cabin's structural wounds. His hands moved with intention, nailing loose boards, patching holes, sweeping away debris. There was something grounding about the work, something steadying that helped him process the night's chaos. But as he worked, he knew that simply returning to routine was impossible. He had been alone for years, shaping his days around silence and rugged simplicity. But everything had changed when he stumbled upon the creek and found the 3 women bathing. Everything that came after had reshaped the rhythm of his life. The cabin felt different now, warmed not just by the fire but by the presence of others, by the quiet glances, the shared meals, the unbroken thread of mutual reliance. For the women, staying in the open wilderness was dangerous. Without their horses, with their supplies scattered across miles of hunted terrain, returning to their people was no simple task. The hunters had pursued them for a reason not yet revealed, but the fear in their movements told a story of conflict, capture and escape that needed no spoken explanation. Elias recognized their predicament deeply. If they stayed with him, danger might eventually find them again. If they traveled alone, the wilderness might consume them or their enemies might reappear. The decision hung heavily over the cabin. As the sun rose higher, they stepped outside again. Elias led them toward the creek, the place where this entire story had begun. The water shimmered cold and clear, reflecting the faces of the 4 souls whose paths had collided by fate's unpredictable hand. The women gathered near the bank, looking at their reflections. It was the first moment they seemed truly calm since Elias met them. The creek's soothing presence washed some weariness from their expressions. Tala moved barefoot along the rocks, letting the water cool her bruised feet. Sani studied the forest lines for signs of danger, though each passing moment softened the tension in her posture. Naira collected small plants near the water's edge, using the quiet to restore herself. Elias remained a few steps back, giving them space while remaining watchful. He felt the familiarity of the creek in his bones. It had been a sanctuary for him during many long years. Now it felt different, a place of beginnings rather than endings. The women returned to him eventually, their steps lighter, their gazes steady. The air held a quiet expectation, Everyone sensed that something needed to be decided, yet none of them were eager to break the fragile moment. The journey ahead could not remain undefined forever. Elias led them back to the cabin and prepared what little food he had stored: jerked meat, a portion of beans, and small pieces of hard bread softened over the fire. It was simple but warm, and the women accepted it with appreciative nods. As they ate, a sense of finality settled around them. The danger had passed, but the question of what lay ahead grew louder in the silence. The three Apache women exchanged thoughtful glances. The wilderness had shaped them into people of instinct and courage. They had spent their lives navigating mountain trails, tribal traditions, and survival on land that demanded respect. They were not helpless travelers in need of rescue. They were warriors, healers, and protectors. But they were also far from home. Returning would be difficult without horses, supplies, or a clear path unmarked by danger. Remaining here would mean choosing a life away from their people. Traveling with Elias would require trust deeper than circumstance alone. Elias understood this. He had never sought companions. Life had taught him to move through the world quietly with only the land as company. But something had awakened in him over the past days. Something he had not felt in years. A pull toward connection, toward belonging, toward protecting more than just himself. The decision belonged to all of them. Fate had woven their paths together, but what came next depended on their courage to choose it. By midday, the decision began taking shape, not through words, but through actions. Sani gathered remaining supplies from the cabin with a clear intention. She moved with purpose, selecting what could be used for travel. Her eyes held a silent resolve that suggested she would brave any path if it ensured her sister's safety.
Naira prepared small bundles of herbs, binding them carefully with strands of dried grass.
The gesture was symbolic, medicine for the journey ahead, whichever direction it might take. Tala collected blankets and jars, her small hands working with determination, hoping to contribute to the path forward. Elias saddled his horse and checked the spare reins. He crafted makeshift packs from worn leather strips. His actions revealed a truth he already embraced: he was not letting them leave alone. The choice became clear. They would travel together, not as strangers bound by chance, but as a single unit forged through hardship, trust, and the quiet understanding that their futures were no longer tied to solitary paths. The sun dipped toward afternoon as they prepared to leave the cabin behind. Elias stood in the doorway one final time, gazing at the structure that had sheltered him for years. It had been his refuge, his fortress, his silent companion. But life moved forward, and this time he would move with it instead of watching from the edges. The Apache women waited near the horse, their expressions calm yet hopeful. They carried no fear now, only the readiness to face whatever lay ahead. Elias stepped away from the cabin and joined them. They turned toward the trail that wound through the pines, leading deeper into the mountains and toward possibilities none of them could yet imagine. The clearing behind them remained silent as they set off, the cabin shrinking into the distance, becoming part of the landscape's quiet memory. The four travelers moved together, their steps synchronizing naturally. The air ahead was open and wide, filled with the scent of pine and dust, promising new chapters, new dangers, new stories shaped by the land's ancient ways. The journey they began that day was not marked by fear but by choice: a cowboy who had lived alone for years, three Apache women who had survived danger and reclaimed their strength, and the bond between them, unexpected, resilient, and destined to shape their futures far beyond the creek where fate first crossed their paths. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, the trail stretched endlessly before them. Their story, born in wilderness, hardened by battle, and bound by trust, had reached its final chapter here. But the life waiting beyond the ridges was only beginning.